Get ready for a journey full of mystery and tension. In 1912, in the small town of Redwood Hollow, nestled in the heart of Briar Ridge, the disappearance of an explorer uncovered a dark secret that no one dared confront. Decades later, a young sheriff is called to investigate what many call the Lost Trail. But what he uncovers is much more than urban legend. It's something from beyond, something that defies reality itself. In a world where the supernatural intertwines with the real, this mystery could be the key to a terrifying fate. Are you ready to uncover the truth? Before we dive in, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, leave a like, and turn on notifications so you don't miss any twists in this electrifying story. In 1912, nestled in the rugged mountains of Briar Ridge, Montana, Sheriff James Walker, a battle-hardened war veteran, was called to investigate the disappearance of local explorer Henry Callaway. Callaway had ventured deep into the wilderness to map out an uncharted section of the mountain range, an area that had long been rumored to hold strange, almost supernatural properties. The only clue left behind was Callaway's journal, which contained cryptic references to a lost trail and eerie descriptions of an unnatural force in the mountain's heart. As Walker combed through the sparse evidence, he found no concrete answers, only a growing sense that something far more sinister was at play. The local townsfolk, too, whispered of unsettling occurrences, unexplained sounds echoing through the trees, flashes of figures in the mist, and eerie, almost hypnotic voices that seemed to call out to those who ventured too close to the lost trail. Despite the mounting fear, Walker refused to close the case, convinced that logic and reason could explain the disappearance. Yet, as the years passed and the mystery remained unsolved, the sheriff found himself growing increasingly obsessed with Callaway's journal. The unsettling feeling that the Lost Trail was more than just a place, a portal to something unknown, began to gnaw at him. The investigation would eventually be closed, but Walker's obsession did not wane. He kept the journal locked away, hoping that one day he might find the answers to what really happened in those mountains. As the years turned into decades, Briar Ridge became a quiet, almost forgotten place. The tale of Henry Callaway faded into legend, and the town of Redwood Hollow continued on with its simple, everyday life. But the whispers of the Lost Trail and its strange, unnatural power never ceased. In 1967, a young and ambitious sheriff, John Carter, was appointed to the neighboring town, a place overshadowed by the eerie reputation of Briar Ridge. After hearing strange reports of unusual activity coming from the mountain, Carter decided to investigate, unaware that he was about to become entangled in a mystery that had haunted the region for over 50 years. When Carter arrived in Redwood Hollow, he was greeted with fearful glances and murmured warnings about Briar Ridge. The locals spoke in hushed tones about the disappearances, the strange happenings, and the eerie presence that seemed to linger in the woods. It wasn't long before Carter discovered Sheriff Walker's old journal, locked away in the town's archives, filled with the same strange references and cryptic notes about the Lost Trail. At first, Carter was skeptical. He assumed that the eerie reports were simply the result of local superstition, but as he began to study Walker's notes and retrace the steps of the past, he began to sense that something far more sinister lay hidden within the forest's depths. Carter was drawn into the mystery, feeling an inexplicable pull to investigate further, but he was also haunted by strange dreams and visions that began to plague his sleep. As he delved deeper into the case, he realized that Walker's obsession with the Lost Trail had been no mere fantasy. It was a dangerous, unsettling truth that threatened to consume anyone who dared to uncover it. Sheriff John Carter's investigation into the Lost Trail deepened as he spent countless nights poring over the pages of Sheriff Walker's journal. The words written by the veteran sheriff, now a faded relic of the past, spoke of an unsettling truth that seemed almost too bizarre to believe. Walker's obsession with the trail was evident in every page, his once logical observations now slipping into confusion and fear. The journal described strange occurrences, ghostly figures that seemed to vanish when approached, unsettling voices that echoed through the trees, and a sense of malevolent presence that Walker could never quite explain. As Carter read, he became increasingly disturbed, feeling as if Walker had crossed a line, one that led him into a realm where reason no longer applied. The deeper Carter went into the case, the more he found himself experiencing what Walker had described: disturbing visions, fleeting glimpses of figures in the shadows, and a growing sense of isolation. Carter could feel the pull of the lost trail, a magnetic force that drew him toward it like a moth to a flame. Yet, he also felt the same creeping unease that had driven Walker into madness. The more Carter read the journal, the more he understood that the sheriff hadn't merely been investigating a missing person. He had been trying to uncover something far more ancient and dangerous. Carter was left with no choice but to follow in Walker's footsteps, but as he did, he could already sense that the cost of uncovering the truth would be far higher than he had ever imagined. The longer he stayed on the case, the more he began to wonder whether his mind, too, would begin to unravel. In the spring of 1967, Sheriff John Carter moved to the quiet town of Redwood Hollow, unaware of the dark history that lingered in the shadows of Briar Ridge. When he began receiving reports of strange happenings on the mountain, he saw it as an opportunity to prove himself, a chance to tackle an unexplained mystery that had long been ignored by others. As he investigated, Carter came across the forgotten journal of Sheriff James Walker, a man whose obsession with the lost trail had long been dismissed as madness. The journal contained detailed accounts of Walker's investigation, which had been abruptly halted after years of fruitless searching. The more Carter read, the more he realized that Walker's notes were not just the ramblings of a broken mind. They spoke of something real, something terrifying. The entries described a place where the laws of nature seemed to bend, where voices from the past could be heard echoing through the trees, and where the very land itself seemed to conspire against those who sought to uncover its secrets. Despite warnings from the locals, Carter felt an undeniable urge to follow in Walker's footsteps and continue the investigation. He could no longer ignore the sense of destiny that seemed to pull him toward the lost trail. But as he ventured deeper into the mountains, the strange occurrences that had plagued Walker's investigation began to follow him. Dreams of shadowy figures, whispered voices, and flickering images began to invade Carter's every thought. Was it the mountain's influence, or was it his mind beginning to fracture, just as Walker's had? Regardless, Carter knew that the trail had been waiting for him, and he had no choice but to follow it, no matter where it led. Sheriff John Carter couldn't escape the pull of the lost trail. It had become an obsession, just as it had been for Sheriff Walker before him. As he ventured deeper into the dense forest that bordered Briar Ridge, the air grew thicker, heavier, as though the very land itself was pressing in on him. Strange sounds filled the silence, whispers carried by the wind, distant voices that sounded eerily familiar. At first, Carter dismissed them as the product of his growing paranoia, but as he explored further, he couldn't ignore the signs of something more sinister. There were traces of past activity, old footprints, broken branches, and strange symbols carved into the bark of trees. But there were no answers, no explanations, only the nagging sense that the trail had been designed to lead him deeper into something he wasn't prepared to face. As Carter delved further into the mystery, he sought out the town's elders, hoping they might have answers, but most of them were reluctant to speak. One by one, they all warned him of the dangers of Briar Ridge, though they spoke in hushed tones, as if afraid that even mentioning it might bring the curse back to life. It wasn't until Carter met old Sarah Monroe, a woman who had lived in Redwood Hollow for her entire life, that he learned the full extent of the legend surrounding the lost trail. She told him of an ancient ritual, one that had been performed by the first settlers to trap whatever had been unleashed in the mountain. She spoke of voices that had been heard in the dead of night, of figures that appeared out of the mist, and of people who had disappeared without a trace, never to be seen again. It was then that Carter realized the truth. Briar Ridge wasn't just a mountain, it was a place where the boundaries between the living and the dead were blurred. The Lost Trail was no mere legend, it was a doorway to something far darker. And Carter could no longer deny that he was being drawn toward it, step by step, toward whatever awaited him at its end. Carter stood at the edge of the Lost Trail, staring into the dense, mist-filled forest ahead. The weight of the journal, now dog-eared and frayed from countless hours of reading, hung heavily in his hands. He knew what he had to do. Following the trail's path was the only way forward, there was no turning back now. As he stepped onto the winding trail, the air grew colder, and the ground beneath his boots seemed to shift with an unnatural heaviness. The further he ventured into the mountain's heart, the more the forest seemed to close in around him, as if the very trees were watching, waiting. Carter's mind raced with fragments of Walker's journal, frantic notations that spoke of strange, unexplainable phenomena that had plagued him during his investigation. Some described a sense of unease, an overwhelming dread that would wash over him whenever he ventured too far. Others mentioned distorted sounds, like whispers, that would suddenly echo from the trees, too distant to make sense of but too close to ignore. But nothing had prepared Carter for what he encountered as he crossed the line, the point where the Lost Trail no longer seemed like a mere path, but a threshold into something else entirely. As he moved deeper, the world around him began to distort. Trees twisted into grotesque shapes, their branches reaching like skeletal fingers, and the ground beneath his feet seemed to shift with each step he took. Time itself seemed to warp, stretching and distorting in a way that made Carter question whether he was still on Earth or had crossed into another realm altogether. He could hear the whispers now, soft, ethereal voices that seemed to call his name. As he followed the voices deeper into the woods, he stumbled upon an ancient stone structure, half buried by the overgrowth. It was here, according to the journal, that the final step of the ritual had been performed. But Carter was not prepared for the sight that met him. The stone altar at the center of the clearing was surrounded by strange markings, and the ground was littered with remnants of long-forgotten rituals. He could feel something pulling at him, urging him to perform the ritual that would either close the portal or open it wide. Carter knew the stakes were higher than ever, but he had already crossed the line, and there was no turning back. As Carter stood amidst the ancient ruins, he could feel the weight of the past pressing down on him. The voices grew louder now, no longer whispers carried on the wind, but distinct, clear, and haunting. They weren't just the wind or his mind playing tricks on him, these were voices of the lost, voices that had been trapped for years, calling out to him, begging for release. Among them, Carter could hear the voice of Sheriff Walker, distorted and distant, but unmistakable. "You don't understand," the voice rasped, "it's not just a portal. It's a prison. A trap for those who seek it." The chilling revelation sent a shiver down Carter's spine. The Lost Trail wasn't just a doorway, it was a prison, holding captive the souls of those who had crossed it, those who had dared to uncover its secrets. As the voices continued to echo around him, Carter's sanity began to unravel. He couldn't tell whether he was hearing them from the past or if they were somehow communicating through time, their messages overlapping in a way that defied logic. The line between the living and the dead had blurred, and Carter was right at the center of it. His pulse raced as the realization set in. He had come too far, and now the voices of the dead were trying to pull him into their world. His thoughts became clouded, his vision hazy as if he were drowning in the thick fog that had settled in the woods. For a moment, he wasn't sure if he was standing in the clearing or if he had already crossed over into the other side. He staggered back, his breath shallow and ragged, but every step he took seemed to bring him closer to the source of the voices. The deeper he went into the woods, the louder the whispers became, until they merged into one overwhelming cacophony of sound. Carter could no longer distinguish individual voices. It was all a single, maddening chorus. Some of the voices screamed in agony, others pleaded for mercy, while others simply repeated the same message over and over: "It's too late. You can't close it. You can't go back." Desperation clawed at Carter's mind as he realized that these weren't just echoes of the past, they were warnings. The Lost Trail wasn't a gateway to knowledge or power, it was a curse, one that had claimed the souls of everyone who had ventured too close to its secrets. And now, it had claimed him as well. Carter's resolve had been shattered by the voices, but he knew he couldn't back down now. The fate of Redwood Hollow, and possibly the entire region, depended on him finding the final clue, Walker's last note in the journal. If there was a way to stop the portal, to close the gateway to whatever lay beyond, Carter had to find it. Exhausted, mentally and physically drained from the voices and the overwhelming presence of the portal, he scoured the ruins for any signs of the ritual that Walker had mentioned. The ancient stones seemed to pulse with an energy that Carter could feel deep in his chest, a vibration that echoed in his bones. He searched frantically, moving over the weathered stone altar and the surrounding markings, but everything seemed wrong. The symbols, once thought to be instructions, now appeared twisted, distorted, as if they had been altered over time, perhaps by those who had used them before, or by the very force that had been unleashed. Then, beneath a pile of leaves and broken branches, Carter found something, a small, weathered piece of paper, nearly illegible but unmistakably Walker's handwriting. It was a final note, a desperate plea for help, describing a ritual that could close the portal. But the note also revealed something more terrifying: the ritual could only be completed at a specific time, under the right conditions, or else the portal would open wide, releasing something far more dangerous than anything Walker had ever feared. The note described an alignment of the stars, a celestial event that would allow the ritual to work. But Carter had no way of knowing if the event was imminent, or if it had already passed. Time, like the landscape around him, was becoming more and more distorted. Carter felt his heart race as he realized the enormity of what he had uncovered. The final clue wasn't just a way to stop the portal, it was a way to end the nightmare for good. But the cost was steep, and the price of failure would be unimaginable. Carter felt the weight of the truth settle over him like a thick fog. The final clue from Sheriff Walker had revealed more than he could have ever anticipated. The Lost Trail wasn't merely a cursed place, it was a gateway, and it was alive, feeding on the souls of those who crossed it. The realization was enough to make his knees buckle. What had started as an investigation into a missing person had become a descent into madness, a battle against forces that no human mind was ever meant to comprehend. The ritual was his last hope, but even now, Carter knew that completing it wasn't guaranteed to work. The portal was more than just a hole in the fabric of reality, it was a living, breathing entity, one that had been dormant for generations, waiting for the right moment to open. And now, that moment had arrived. Carter had spent days trying to piece together Walker's cryptic instructions, but every time he thought he had figured it out, the portal seemed to shift, to change its rules, to mock him. As he stood in the ruins, staring at the darkened sky, he realized that even if he succeeded in completing the ritual, there would be consequences. The truth always had a price. Carter had already seen glimpses of what the portal could unleash: the shadows, the whispers, the distorted visions of those who had crossed before him. But nothing could have prepared him for the true horrors that were now threatening to spill into the world. The time was running out. As the stars began to align, Carter's heart pounded in his chest. He knew he couldn't hesitate. The ritual had to be completed, or the consequences would be too great to fathom. But as he began the incantations, a cold, sickening feeling washed over him. Something was wrong. The ground beneath his feet began to tremble, and the air grew thick with an unnatural energy. He could hear the voices again, louder now, more frantic. "You're too late," they screamed. "It's already begun." A blinding light exploded from the heart of the portal, and Carter felt his entire body seize with terror. His breath caught in his throat, and he realized with a sickening clarity that the portal had never been meant to be closed. It had only been waiting for someone foolish enough to open it fully. As the light grew brighter, Carter's thoughts became disjointed. The ritual had failed, and the consequences of his actions had already begun to unfold. The world around him distorted, reality itself seemed to warp, and he felt his very soul being pulled toward the heart of the storm. Carter didn't remember the moment when he crossed over, but when he came to, everything was different. The world had changed. The once familiar trees of Briar Ridge now seemed like twisted, gnarled figures, their branches reaching out like skeletal hands. The air was thick with an otherworldly fog, and the sky above was an unnatural shade of black, swirling with dark clouds that seemed to pulse with malevolent energy. Carter knew he was no longer in the world he had known. He had crossed the threshold, and now he was trapped in the place that had consumed so many before him. The voices that had tormented him for so long were now all around him, their whispers like a thousand insects buzzing in his ears. They weren't just the echoes of the dead anymore, they were alive, tangible, and they were coming for him. He stumbled through the darkened landscape, his mind unraveling with each step he took. Every direction he turned seemed to lead him deeper into the void. The further he went, the stronger the pull of the lost trail became, as if it were guiding him towards something far worse than he had ever imagined. And then, through the fog, he saw them, figures moving in the distance, distorted shapes that seemed to flicker in and out of existence, like shadows of the past. As Carter drew closer, he realized they weren't just figures. They were people, or what was left of them. Faces twisted in agony, their eyes hollow and empty. These were the souls of those who had been lost, those who had vanished into the void, never to return. They reached out to him, their hands desperate, pleading. Carter wanted to scream, to run, but his legs were heavy, his body paralyzed with fear. He knew that he had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. The portal wasn't just a doorway to another world, it was a trap, and he had become its latest victim. The whispers grew louder, and Carter felt his sanity slipping away. In the distance, he could see the silhouette of the lost trail, stretching out like a never-ending abyss. He knew he couldn't escape. The portal was too powerful, and he was too far gone. He could only watch as the darkness consumed everything, and the last remnants of his world faded into the void. Carter was no longer sure how much time had passed. The days seemed to blur together in this place, a strange void between worlds where reality no longer seemed to have any meaning. He had tried everything, running, hiding, even screaming into the abyss, but it didn't matter. The voices wouldn't stop, and neither would the shadowy figures that seemed to follow him wherever he went. They were the lost souls of Briar Ridge, or at least that's what he assumed. They were the echoes of the past, doomed to wander the void for eternity, their faces twisted with sorrow and rage. They never spoke, they simply watched him, their hollow eyes filled with desperation. It was then that Carter realized the truth. They weren't trying to communicate with him, they were trying to warn him. The lost trail was more than just a place, it was a living thing, a parasite that fed on the souls of those who ventured too close. The portal wasn't just a doorway, it was a trap, a device to pull the souls of the living into its dark depths, to trap them forever in a world that was neither here nor there. And now, Carter was one of them. He had been pulled into the portal, into the heart of Briar Ridge's curse, and he was never going to escape. The realization hit him like a punch to the gut, but there was no time for despair. There was still something he had to do, some final task that he had to complete. He had to stop the cycle, end the curse that had plagued the mountain for so long, or else more would suffer like him. As Carter moved deeper into the heart of the lost trail, he felt the pull of the portal growing stronger. The ground beneath his feet seemed to tremble, and the fog around him thickened. The world was shifting, bending to the will of the portal. The shadows of the lost souls swirled around him, whispering in his ears, urging him forward. He had no choice but to follow, to see this through to the end. But he wasn't alone. He could feel a presence behind him, something dark and malevolent, something that had been watching him from the moment he entered the portal. And now, it was closing in. As Carter turned to face the darkness, he saw it, a shadow so black that it seemed to absorb the light around it, a shape that was almost human, but not quite. Its eyes burned with a cold fire, and its mouth twisted into a grin that sent a shiver down Carter's spine. It was the source of the curse, the one who had been feeding on the souls of the lost, the one who had created the portal. Carter knew that this was his last chance to stop it. He reached for his gun, but it was gone, lost in the darkness. There was nothing left to fight with, no weapon that could stop this thing. All he had was his will, his determination to end the curse. He took a deep breath and stepped forward. The final confrontation was inevitable. Carter had known it would come, but the reality of it felt more terrible than he had ever imagined. As he stepped deeper into the heart of the lost trail, the darkness thickened, and the oppressive weight of the curse seemed to suffocate him. He could feel the eyes of the lost souls on him, their hollow gazes burning into his soul, as if they were begging him to save them from the eternal prison they had been cast into. But Carter knew that there was no salvation for them, not now, not anymore. He had to focus on the task at hand. The dark figure, what he had come to understand as the source of the portal, was close now. He could feel it, could hear its breath, cold and heavy, behind him. It was only a matter of time before it would show itself again, and when it did, he would have to face it head-on. The shadow seemed to glide silently through the darkness, a presence that was more felt than seen, a being of pure malice that thrived on fear. It spoke without words, its voice a low hum in Carter's mind, a sound that reverberated deep in his chest, like a distant drumbeat. "You shouldn't have come," it whispered, and Carter felt his heart stop for a moment. He had heard the voices of the lost souls in his mind, but this was different. This voice wasn't a whisper, it was a command, an absolute force that threatened to crush him. Carter gritted his teeth, pushing forward, refusing to back down. He had come this far, and he wasn't going to stop now. The curse of Briar Ridge had taken enough lives, and he wasn't going to let it claim his own. The shadow loomed over him, its form shifting and warping, but Carter didn't flinch. He knew what he had to do. He raised his arms and, in a desperate attempt to break the curse, he invoked the final step of the ritual. But nothing happened. The darkness only deepened. The portal was still open, still drawing everything into its vast emptiness. Carter realized with a sickening sense of finality that he was too late. There was no stopping the inevitable now. The shadow enveloped him, its cold grip tightening around his throat. Carter couldn't scream. He couldn't even breathe. Everything went dark. Carter's consciousness was fading, slipping into the abyss, but even in the depths of the void, he could still feel the pull of the lost trail. It wasn't just his physical body being consumed, his very essence, his soul, was being drawn into the darkness. The oppressive weight of the curse seemed to pull him deeper, and he realized, with a dawning sense of horror, that he wasn't just fighting to escape the portal. He was fighting to preserve the last remnants of his humanity. As he descended into the heart of the darkness, memories of his life before Briar Ridge flashed through his mind, his days as a young sheriff, the pride he had felt when he had first put on the badge, his hopes and dreams for the future. But all of it seemed so distant now, as if it belonged to someone else. The shadow surrounding him was no longer a single entity, it had become a part of him, a force that was consuming him from the inside out. His body ached as if it was being torn apart by invisible hands, and his mind was filled with distorted images of faces of the lost souls who had come before him, who had met the same fate. He saw the face of Sheriff Walker, his eyes hollow with the weight of his own obsession, and he saw Calloway, his expression twisted with terror. They were all trapped here, all victims of the curse, unable to escape. But Carter wasn't ready to give in yet. There had to be a way out. He had to find a way to close the portal, to free himself and the others trapped in this nightmare. As the darkness tightened its grip on him, he reached deep within, trying to summon whatever strength he had left. He remembered the final clue, the ritual that could close the portal. But it wasn't enough. The forces at play here were beyond his understanding, beyond his control. The portal was no longer just a doorway, it was a force of nature, something ancient and incomprehensible that couldn't be stopped. And Carter realized, with a sinking feeling in his chest, that he had been playing into its hands all along. The curse of Briar Ridge wasn't something that could be defeated, it was something that had to be accepted. And as he fell further into the abyss, he understood the cruel truth: the portal wasn't a passage, it was a prison. As Carter's last breath rattled in his chest, he was consumed entirely by the portal, his physical form becoming nothing more than a faint memory. There was no light in this place, no warmth, only an endless, suffocating darkness that pressed in from all sides. But even in this void, Carter's mind remained intact, his consciousness aware of his own descent. The lost trail had claimed him, body and soul, and now he was part of it, trapped in a timeless prison where nothing ever changed. It was as though he had become a shadow of himself, a mere echo of his former self. The curse of Briar Ridge wasn't a simple matter of supernatural forces, it was an eternal cycle, one that was destined to repeat for eternity, trapping every soul that entered within its grasp. Those who ventured too close, who uncovered its secrets, were doomed to join the ranks of the lost, forever wandering in the darkness with no hope of escape. Carter could hear the voices of the other souls trapped in this place, their whispers mingling with his own thoughts, creating a chorus of desperation that filled his mind. The souls of the past, the souls of the present, they were all here, together in this prison, condemned to live out the same nightmare for eternity. He could feel them, their presence all around him, 1,000 ghostly hands reaching out, pulling him deeper into the darkness. But Carter didn't struggle anymore. There was no point. He had come to understand the nature of the curse. There was no escaping it. There was no fighting it. All he could do was accept his fate. As the voices swirled around him, growing louder and more frantic, Carter closed his eyes, embracing the silence that came with the final descent. He had become one with Briar Ridge, a part of its endless cycle. He was no longer Sheriff Carter. He was just another lost soul, wandering the void, waiting for the next soul to stumble upon the lost trail. And when they did, they would hear his voice calling out to them, a whisper in the darkness, urging them to turn back. But it was too late. It always was. The last remnants of Sheriff Carter's humanity were fading fast, absorbed completely by the dark energy of Briar Ridge. But deep in the heart of the mountain, there was something else, something ancient and aware, something that had been watching the events unfold for far longer than any mortal could comprehend. As the portal's grip tightened around Carter's soul, the unseen presence seemed to stir, as if sensing his surrender to the inevitable. For decades, it had remained dormant, hidden in the shadows, feeding off the fear and confusion of those who dared to approach the lost trail. But now, with Carter's descent, something had changed. It could feel the shift, the merging of the past and present, the way the curse had evolved. It wasn't just trapping souls anymore, it was feeding off them, growing stronger with each life it consumed. And now, Carter had become a part of its ever-growing darkness, an offering to the power that lay beneath the surface of Briar Ridge. But the entity wasn't satisfied. It was searching for something more, a way to escape the confines of the mountain and spread its influence beyond the cursed land. It had seen how Walker's obsession had led him to the brink of madness, how Calloway's curiosity had doomed him, and how Carter's determination had sealed his fate. But none of them had understood the true nature of the force they were dealing with. It wasn't just a portal, it was a prison, and it was hungry. As Carter's consciousness began to blur, a final vision filled his mind, the image of an enormous figure looming in the distance, its shape shrouded in the darkness of the lost trail. It was the presence that had been pulling the strings all along. It was waiting. Time lost all meaning within the depths of Briar Ridge, but for those who still had the capacity to understand, the consequences of seeking knowledge were all too clear. Sheriff Carter had been a fool to think he could control the powers of the lost trail. He had been drawn into the mystery, believing that his investigation could bring clarity, only to find that the truth was far darker than he could have imagined. Now, as he drifted deeper into the clutches of the mountain, the weight of his actions pressed on him more heavily than ever. It wasn't just his life that had been lost, it was the very fabric of reality that had been torn open by his attempts to understand the impossible. The portal was not just a gateway to another realm, it was a doorway to madness, a tear in the very foundation of the world. The shadows that moved within the portal were not mere illusions. They were remnants of every soul that had ever been consumed by the lost trail, every person who had dared to uncover its secrets. And as Carter's mind began to unravel, he saw them, hundreds of faces, each one a twisted reflection of the lives they had lived before they were claimed by the mountain. He saw the face of Sheriff Walker, his eyes empty and lifeless, forever trapped in the same cycle of obsession that had led him to his doom. He saw Calloway, his body distorted and broken, his soul forever bound to the cursed land. And he saw the faces of those who had come before them, victims of the trail, forgotten by time but not by the dark forces that had ensnared them. In the distance, the presence of the entity grew stronger, its hunger becoming more palpable. It was feeding off their fear, feeding off the chaos that had been unleashed by Carter's actions. The question lingered in Carter's mind, even as his consciousness began to fade: what was the true price of knowledge? What was the cost of seeking the truth when that truth had the power to destroy everything? Sheriff John Carter, now fully immersed in the horrors of Briar Ridge, had become more than just a man driven by curiosity. He was a vessel for the ancient forces that had long held dominion over the lost trail. His body and mind had been ravaged, but deep inside, a sliver of resistance remained. He knew he had to make a choice: let himself be consumed by the malevolent power or fight to protect the town he had sworn to serve. The portal was growing, its dark energy swirling faster, feeding off the despair that had been planted by the curse. Carter's final moments were a frantic struggle against the inevitable. He couldn't stop the growing storm, but he could try to delay it. As he stood at the edge of the swirling blackness, the presence of the entity loomed closer, a manifestation of every nightmare and fear that had ever been whispered in the dark. The very air seemed to vibrate with its power. With his last ounce of strength, Carter threw himself into the heart of the storm. What happened next was beyond comprehension. Time folded in on itself, and the very essence of Briar Ridge seemed to shift. Carter's body was torn apart by the energies around him, but his soul remained, tethered to the mountain, caught in the web of dark forces that had shaped his fate. As he fell into the abyss, his thoughts drifted back to the earlier days of his investigation, the warnings, the faces of those lost, the cryptic messages from Sheriff Walker's journal. He had come so close to understanding, yet he had been blind to the truth all along. The portal was not just a doorway, it was a prison, and those who sought to break its chains were the ones who were bound. The aftermath of Carter's sacrifice was not what he had hoped for. The town of Redwood Hollow had been spared, for now, but the shadow of Briar Ridge loomed larger than ever. The portal had been temporarily sealed, but the forces contained within it were not so easily defeated. Briar Ridge was not just a place, it was a living entity, and like all things alive, it adapted, it waited, and it endured. Carter's disappearance became another tale to be whispered among the townsfolk, a tragic ending to a mystery that had already claimed so many lives. But the people of Redwood Hollow could not ignore the truth. They knew that the mountain was not done with them. The strange occurrences that had begun with the disappearance of Henry Calloway had never truly ceased. The voices from beyond the grave still echoed in the distance, a constant reminder that the lost trail was still out there, still waiting for the next fool to stumble upon it. In the years that followed, the legend of Briar Ridge grew. Those who had lived through the horrors of the past, those who had been touched by its darkness, began to leave the town, unable to bear the weight of what they had experienced. Others came to try their luck, driven by the allure of the unexplained, only to vanish like so many before them. And so the cycle continued. The truth of Briar Ridge, what lay within its depths, what waited beyond the veil, remained hidden, locked away in the shadows. Yet, deep in the heart of the mountain, something stirred. The portal, though weakened, was not destroyed. And someday, someone would come looking for answers. But that day was not today. Years passed, and the mountain stood silent, but the whispers from Briar Ridge never truly stopped. People who had once known the truth about the lost trail lived in fear, always glancing over their shoulders, certain that the past would come back to claim them. The mountain had a strange way of pulling at the souls of those who had walked its treacherous path. It was as if the land itself had become infected, cursed by something far older and more powerful than anyone could comprehend. The town of Redwood Hollow began to crumble. Businesses shut down. The townsfolk grew distant, haunted by the knowledge that something was wrong. Some of the old-timers who had once dismissed the supernatural now spoke in hushed tones about the mountain, about the curse that had never been broken. They knew, deep down, that Briar Ridge had not been cleansed, that Carter's sacrifice had only delayed the inevitable. And so, a new generation of lawmen took on the mantle of sheriff, each of them inheriting the stories, the fear, and the responsibility that came with it. But none were prepared for what they would face. None knew the truth. No one ever really understood that Briar Ridge was not just a place, it was a gateway, a living being that fed on the souls of those who dared to venture too close. And as long as it stood, the curse would live on. Sheriff John Carter had been the last to confront the mountain's horrors head-on. He had been the one to try and break the cycle, to stop the dark forces from claiming anyone else. But in doing so, he had only ensured that his story would become another part of the legend, his name whispered in the same breath as those who had come before him, victims of the curse of Briar Ridge. The town, once full of life, became a shadow of itself, and the mountain, with its secrets and its whispers, waited. The portal remained, dormant but never forgotten. And one day, perhaps soon, someone would again step across the threshold into the unknown. Someone would listen to the voices that echoed through the trees. And the cycle would begin anew. As the years turned to decades, the story of Briar Ridge became little more than a legend, a tale to be told around campfires and in the quiet corners of bars. The old sheriff's office, where Walker and Carter had once worked, stood abandoned, a monument to the strange and terrible past of the town. No one ever spoke of it openly. No one ever mentioned the lost trail or the mountain beyond it. It was simply too dangerous, too frightening. The few remaining souls who still lived in Redwood Hollow were the ones who could not leave, for they had been forever touched by the cursed mountain. The voices they had heard, the things they had seen, had changed them in ways that no one could explain. Even the bravest souls had learned not to speak of it, for fear of drawing the mountain's attention. But sometimes, in the dead of night, when the wind howled through the trees, the whispers would return. They would drift down the ridge and into the town, as though seeking the next person who would listen. Sometimes, late at night, someone would hear them, soft at first, like the rustling of leaves or the distant murmur of a stream. And then they would grow louder. The voices of the lost, the voices of those who had been taken. Sheriff James Walker, Sheriff John Carter, Henry Calloway. They all whispered from the shadows, begging for someone to listen. But no one ever did. The story of Briar Ridge was over, at least for now. And as long as the voices remained unheard, the town would endure. But deep in the heart of the mountain, the portal still waited. Someday, someone would come looking for answers. Someday, the whispers would call again. But for now, the silence remained. And in the stillness, Briar Ridge, with its ancient curse and dark history, stood untouched, biding its time. And somewhere, in the depths of the lost trail, the shadow of something far darker than anyone could imagine still loomed. Thank you for following this dark and thrilling journey through the haunted trails of Briar Ridge. We hope you found yourself entranced by the story of Sheriff Walker, Sheriff Carter, and the cursed mountain that holds secrets better left untouched. If you enjoyed this tale, be sure to leave a comment below sharing your thoughts, theories, or any personal experiences you've had with mysteries of the unknown. Don't forget to hit the like button, subscribe to our channel, and ring the notification bell so you don't miss any more chilling stories like this one. Until next time, stay curious, and beware of the things that whisper in the dark.